Thank you. I'm always really biased. That's one of my absolute favorite Nike commercials. But it's pretty brilliant, I think. So thank you for the great introduction. And as you saw in that video, it's all about being first. About a year ago, I did something that no other African or Black woman had ever dared to do before. And so I'd like to start with kind of a description of skeleton. We just saw a little bit of it in the video, but I don't ever assume that anyone knows what skeleton is, because you get a lot of definitions when you say, I do the sport of skeleton, and people get confused. So I always like to start with that. So with millions of people from all around the world watching, I dared to do the sport of skeleton, which is essentially you going down head first at 80 miles an hour on a frozen ice track with your face just inches from the ice. Who's signing up for that? And that's essentially the sport of skeleton. And it goes a little something like this. I'll just describe it a bit further. So you first sprint on ice for about 30 meters. Yes, I said on ice for about 30 meters before you dive onto your tummy onto something called a sled. So you kind of do like a little Superman dive onto your sled. And the sled is actually essentially a tray about the size of a large suitcase. It's about this long. Once you're on the sled, just imagine being on a giant frozen water slide with massive twists and turns, and you're going about as fast as your car goes down the freeway. Yeah, that fast. So once you're navigating your way down the track, you have no safety belt and you have no braking mechanism. And your heart is pretty much beating faster and faster with every turn that you're going down. And also your vision gets a little blurry because you're going so fast. And for about 60 seconds, it's just you, the ice, and your sled trying to get across the finish line as quickly as possible. Now, did I mention that I did this voluntarily? And I did. And so as the intro said, I made history. This time last year, I was in Pyeongchang, South Korea, making history as the first Nigerian to ever compete in the Winter Olympics. I also made history as the first Black and African woman to compete in the sport of skeleton at the Olympics. Now, this all sounds wonderful, but you might be wondering, outside of the amazing pizza that's available at the Olympic Village, and it was very, very good, by the way, why would I, a then 36-year-old, mid-level professional working at the time at one of the world's most recognizable brands, I was working at Nike, with a fancy job title, decide and choose to put all that aside and go on a 100-day journey to pursue the Olympics? Well, for me, it was all about shifting the narrative. And this is super important because this was basically the driving force, the motivating force that led me to do what I did. Shifting the narrative was very important because my journey was inspired by the fact that I discovered that no African or Black woman had ever competed in the sport of skeleton at the Olympics. And I thought, wow, we have over 1 billion people in Africa, and there's not been one person that has done this. And I recognized an opportunity at that point to shift the narrative of what was possible coming from the continent of Africa. So Africa is very severely underrepresented at the Winter Olympics. So I don't know if any of you guys watched the Olympics last year. Did anyone get a chance? Check me slaying? Yes. You only saw 8 countries that were there from Africa. And that was historic, right? 8 countries. Africa has 54 countries, though. So there's still quite a lot of work to do. And it makes sense, obviously. I mean, the conditions in Africa, we don't have a lot of winter kind of climates. Also, the facilities aren't there. And also, it's really expensive to do these sports. But I wanted to show people that despite these barriers, anything is possible, that anybody could do anything. And I wanted to shift the narrative of what people have come to expect from the continent of Africa. And so that's why I went on the journey. And ultimately, for me, it was about inspiring the next generation to dream without limits. And so that's what I really want to talk to you guys today about, is my journey shifting the narrative. I want to share with you what that journey looked like, some of the lessons that I learned, because I believe that, I'm pretty special, but I'm not that special. I'm just a regular person just like you who had the desire to do something different and make a choice to do something about it. I saw an opportunity where I thought that I could solve and use my gifts and talents to do something about it. So let's talk about shifting the narrative and what that means. And also in your lives, everyday lives, whether it's in your personal life or your career, there are opportunities all around us to shift the narrative. And what this journey has really taught me is that we all have the power to take those steps to do it. So I hope that what I share with you, you can take and you can apply, and we're all going to be shifting the narratives. I actually like to call it slaying the narrative. Forget shifting, I like to slay. But first I want to just give you a little context as to who I am and what led me to this point in my life. So this is my birth picture, and I wanted to start here because actually for me as a Nigerian, the name is really important in my culture. I am from the Yoruba culture in Nigeria. Yeah, we have some Nigerians. Yes, yes. Yes, it's really, really important. And in my culture, children get named, babies get named 7 days after they're born. And that's because it's really important to understand the circumstances around a child's birth. If you hear the name, you can hear the story of what was going on with the family or the child at that particular point in time. So my full name is Simidele, and that means accompany me home. And you can see right here, I was born in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. So yes, I have multiple passports, which helps, but I'm Nigerian to the bone. But my name is Simidele because I was born in Canada and I was essentially accompanying my parents back home to Nigeria. So a couple months after I was born, my parents went back to Nigeria and I accompanied them home. And it's interesting because that was actually a sneak peek into kind of how my life ended up playing out. But this is where my story starts. So I lived in Nigeria until I was 6 years old. And after that, then my family moved to the US and we moved to Canada as well. And I grew up in different parts of the US and Canada until 7th grade. I moved to Louisville, Kentucky. And that's where, for the most part, that I grew up. In 7th grade is also where I pretty much discovered sport. And I started playing sports on a pretty active level. I played a number of different sports, including those that you see there, track and field. I played field hockey, volleyball, basketball, you name it, I played it and I loved it. And this is where the athlete in me really started to arise. But the sport that kind of stuck with me most is track and field. And this is where I really excelled. And this is what I call my original Olympic dream. I had a vision that I would be at the Olympics, the sun would be shining, and I would be jumping in sand. And I came really close to that vision. In college, I was a 4-time All-American at the University of Kentucky. And those that don't know what an All-American is, it means you're really good. It means you are one of the top athletes in the nation, in the United States. So that was quite an honor. And I felt that I had a lot of potential to really make it at the Olympic level. So I tried out for 2 Olympic teams in 2004 as well as 2008. And I came very, very close to making those teams, but just didn't quite make it. And that obviously was a huge disappointment. I had spent years of my life devoted to this goal, and falling short was very disappointing. But that's when I realized that, hey, you can give something your best, and maybe you don't quite make it, and then you keep going. And so for me, I decided to call it quits. I hung up my spikes, and I retired for about 10 years. I moved on with my life, and this is actually where my shifting the narrative story really begins. So I had a job opportunity and I had the chance to move to South Africa, Johannesburg, South Africa, about 5.5 years ago. And it was awesome because before that, I was living in Beaverton, Oregon. And if you've ever lived there, you know that that was a come up to go for me to move to South Africa. So I was quite pleased with that. And so my shifting the narrative journey really begins here because this is where I started noticing a disconnect. I started noticing that there was a disconnect between what the world sees and perceives of Africa and what I was experiencing every day living and working on the continent. So this picture here is, to me, kind of representative of what the world typically sees when they think about Africa. To me, this picture represents despair, hopelessness, death, disease, destruction. Those are the stories and the narratives that get told about Africa. And it just wasn't matching up with what I was seeing living and working in Johannesburg. What I was seeing was beauty, vibrancy, resilience, innovation. And I was starting to know more about the business context as well, because I was working there. So I started hearing stats like Africa's got the youngest consumers, in the world. The average age of an African is 19 years old. Africa also has 6 out of 10 of the world's fastest growing economies. Also, Africa has more than 400 companies that are driving more than $1 billion of revenue. And these are stats that we don't hear about. That is not the story that we are told about Africa. So that started getting me curious and interested. So I was there in a corporate sense, but I started getting a sense that maybe there was more that I could do in my personal capacity to shift the narrative. And oh yeah, I love to travel. So while I've been in South Africa for the last 5.5 years, I've made it my personal agenda and my personal mission to travel to as many African countries as possible. So here's a picture from Dakar, Senegal. This is the Renaissance statue, and I went there a few years back to visit. And I was just shocked that I'd never heard of this statue before. It's about 50 meters tall, and it's taller than the Christ the Redeemer in Rio. It's taller than the Statue of Liberty. And it's really dope as well because it represents African freedom and independence, and the story behind it is really, really deep. And I was shocked that this beautiful, beautiful statue that's sitting here right on the continent, I had never heard of, I'd never seen in a magazine, and it's taller than all of these statues that we hear about all the time. So I started also kind of taking those kind of things into consideration. And then, of course, you have some holiday time and you get to go to the beaches. This is a picture from Zanzibar. And you can see there, it's beautiful white sand beaches with turquoise waters, the waters and the beach setting that we all dream of. This is right here on the continent of Africa. And by the way, this is just one of many. And again, these are not the stories that we hear about or people talk about when it comes to Africa. So for me, that 5 years that I've been in South Africa has really impacted me. And this is the conversations that I started having with myself and started asking myself that, well, it's great that I'm here, I'm working in my corporate capacity, but I really feel a personal calling to do something in my capacity to help shift the narrative. So, and now I had this opportunity to do that. And so now begins the part where I actually started shifting the narrative. And this is where I want to share with you kind of some of the lessons that I learned along the way. So there's 3 key things that I've learned as I've talked about and experienced shifting the narrative. It starts with a choice. So my choice started when, in December of 2016, a friend of mine sent me a link to an article about the Nigerian women's bobsled team. And like most people, I probably had only heard of bobsled through what? The movie Cool Runnings. Exactly. And that was my only point of reference. But there they were, these 3 women who said they wanted to make history. They wanted to become the first African bobsled team to go to the Olympics. And I immediately was hooked. And given what I just mentioned about what I was seeing and starting to understand and seeing the disconnect in the narratives that were being told and the reality of what I was living, I knew instinctively, immediately, that this was my opportunity and my way to play a part in shifting the narrative. But big problem, I know nothing about bobsled. What's gonna happen? So I did what everyone would do. I hit these girls up on Instagram. And I reached out and I said, hey, I just saw this article and I'm super interested. Are you looking for team members? Because in my mind, bobsled is a 4-person sport and there were only 3 of them. So they quickly corrected me and let me know that actually for women, it's still only a 2-woman sport. And we actually have our team and an alternate. So yeah, you're good. So that was the immediate response. And at that point, I thought, okay, well, maybe that wasn't my opportunity to shift the narrative. And I kind of just went on minding my business. And then a few months later, I saw this on their Instagram. And that dream was reborn. And that opportunity and that choice to shift the narrative was reborn. So this was the post that was posted by the Nigerian Bobsled and Skeleton Federation. It was for a tryout in Houston, Texas. So the federation is based in Houston. Anybody who's been to Houston probably knows there's lots of Nigerians there. So our founder was actually based in Houston, and so that's why the tryouts were there. So I saw this post on Instagram about 2 weeks before the actual tryouts. And I really wasn't sure what to do with this information because I knew, okay, maybe they already had their team in place. And I thought, okay, I don't know, I live in Johannesburg. Am I supposed to fly to Houston for this? And then I just also wasn't sure, what am I trying out for? Is it for the Olympics? Is it for the next Olympics? And then if you see there in the fine print, it says 18 to 35. And just a week before I saw this post, I turned 36. Dang it. But this is where the choice really is the important part and the big first step in shifting the narrative. No narrative gets shifted accidentally. You have to make a deliberate choice. So even though I had all these things I wasn't sure about, I had all of these fears, would I be good enough? Do I know anything about bobsled? What does this mean? Am I too old? I had to make a choice because I was that passionate about shifting the narrative, and it starts with that first step, and that's making the choice. So I decided 2 weeks before this tryout that I was gonna go and try out. And by the way, I was still in my 10-year retirement when I saw this post. That also was one of my fears. I had not competed at a high level in 10 years. So was I ready? I didn't know. But I was willing to find out, and I felt that I had absolutely nothing to lose. So I traveled to Houston. I flew all the way from Johannesburg, and I was at the tryout for 1 day. There were 3 things you had to do. You had to do a 45-meter sprint, you had to do a standing long jump, and then you had to do a shot put throw. And I felt like if I can just make it through without pulling a muscle, that is a win at 36 years old. So I felt I could make it. And so I used the 2 weeks between when I booked my ticket and when I went to try to get my muscles back in shape. And I made it through. And not only did I make it through, but I made it through enough to make the team. And I was invited back to a camp the next month. So making that choice and doing that first step was huge. So the next part of kind of shifting the narrative, once I decided to make that choice, it was then about kind of how was I going to step into this new world? What does this new world look like for me? And again, I knew nothing about this new world. So when I showed up to the camp that I was then invited to, it was a lot of learning. I had no idea about anything, and I felt just like this picture. I felt like a fish out of water. And that's when I actually made the transition from a focus to bobsled to now a focus to skeleton. One, because at that camp, it was confirmed that, hey, the team is already in place for bobsled. And somebody actually suggested, hey, would you be interested in skeleton? And like many people, I said, what's skeleton? And when they showed me, I said, huh? And I didn't think I would be interested either. But after I made my choice and said, I'm interested, my choice was really about shifting the narrative. So whether the vehicle, literally, the vehicle was a bobsled or a skeleton sled, I stayed focused on that choice that I made, and that was to shift the narrative. But I still had to start from somewhere, and I was starting below ground zero, because this is a sport where nobody from my country knew anything about it. I couldn't ask anyone from, my country, my family, my friends. No one could help me. And so I had to rely on the community of people to try to figure out how I could somehow fit in and not feel like an imposter, which was very difficult because I looked very different than anybody that was in the sport. And there I was with my beads, with my braids, with my Davido blasting in my Beats headphones. And I was just kind of somebody that was trying to just figure it out. And there was a whole new language as well that was spoken, all kinds of technical terms that I didn't know about, equipment things, and I had to learn a whole new culture essentially. But what I realized in that space was that although I'm trying to shift the narrative, it was really important to stay true to myself. And the more I stayed true to myself, that would just help me build my confidence and know that I could do it. I always thought about why I was doing it, the reason that I was doing it, for the people back home, because this barrier needed to be broken. And then what I realized is that I would need to curate what I wanted the new narrative to be. And for me, that was rooted in how I wanted Black women and African women to be represented. So I started thinking about, what do I want to show up looking like? When I do show up in this room, when I'm an imposter and nobody's ever seen anybody like me, what do I want their first impression to be of an African woman? And I started curating that. And that was a head-to-toe curation. So it started with my braids, and this was something super important to me. First of all, braids are very convenient and practical, especially when you have to wear a helmet. You saw it in that video. I'm always wearing a helmet. So from a practicality standpoint, it made sense. But braids to me represented more than practicality. Braids were super important because I just felt that they represented an African beauty. Specifically, these braids that you see in these pictures, they're called Fulani braids from a tribe in Nigeria. And you've seen them, stars like Alicia Keys wears them and other stars, well, she did back in the day anyways, where you have two braids coming down in front. Usually there's beads and things and they're decorated. And I just thought that if I was gonna be stepping out into the world and wanting to represent what it is to be a beautiful, intelligent, strong, Black, African woman, that the braids were an important crown to that. And I wanted the world to see and celebrate that. And that was all part of how I could curate the narrative that I wanted. Then the beads. The beads were really important to me as well, because those told a deeper story. For me, the beads told a deeper story of the women that had come before me, specifically Venus and Serena Williams. These were heroes of mine growing up, and I called them the original trailblazers. And if you remember, when they first came out back in the day, they had those beads, and those beads were iconic. And so I wanted to pay homage to that legacy in some way by rocking beads. So up until this day, every time that you see me compete, I'm usually wearing those beads just to pay homage, and they're cute as well. Don't mind being cute. Oh, sorry. And then the last piece, now we're working my way down the head-to-toe look, was then what are the little elements that I could put into my equipment to tell a deeper story about what I wanted the narrative to be and how I wanted to curate the narrative of what it means to be a modern African woman. And so what you see, I guess to my left, is what the back of my sled looks like. This is a pattern that I had designed. And so hopefully you can see it. Some people see different things when they look at it, but what it is the continent of Africa, and you can also see kind of the silhouette of a woman's face. So I just felt like that was super strong. And it has a deeper meaning as well because this was a logo of an organization that I co-founded back in Johannesburg that was all about women's empowerment and connecting women and bringing them together to elevate them. So I wanted to carry that with me as I was going to Pyeongchang. And then, of course, you have to have the shoes. The shoes have to be on point. And so my good friends at Nike were able to design some shoes for me that spoke to who I truly was. And that was all part of the curated narrative that I wanted to drive. So you have the green and white, which is all about Nigerian colors. And then they had the date that I made history, as well as equality, which really spoke to kind of equality in sport because I was doing something to break barriers. And so curating is the second part of kind of one of my lessons I feel that I've learned through this journey of how to shift the narrative. So first you make the choice, but then you have to be really strategic about how you curate the new narrative that you want to drive. So the third piece is commitment. So you've made the choice, you've now curated the new narrative, now you have to commit to it. And so this is me in Pyeongchang, and Pyeongchang was really a starting point. I really see it as a starting point. Now I have a longer term commitment to continue to shift the narrative. And I've made that commitment through to the next Olympics in Beijing 2022. Narratives typically don't get shifted overnight. That's the reality. So you have to be committed for however long that journey takes. And it's an evolution. It's always a conversation. And so I have taken that step. And there's still tons of work to be done. So I mentioned earlier that Africa had 8 countries, which represented about 8% of the total countries that were at the Winter Olympics. Europe as a continent, 52%. So the gap is still very, very wide. And I'm hoping that what I've done to open the door will inspire other African countries to come along as well. And who knows where we can be by 2022. The other thing that I'm going hard at to continue to shift the narrative is it's one thing to participate, but it's a whole nother thing to be a contender. So the goal is by 2022 that the narrative is shifting from, oh, cute, the Africans are here, to wow, the Africans are winning medals. And that's now the next level of the narrative that I'm trying to drive. Norway, just by themselves, won 39 medals at the last Winter Olympics. And the rest of the European countries also followed suit with 21. And Africa had 0. So the race is on for which African country is going to win the first Winter Olympic medal. And that's the commitment that it's going to take to continue to shift the narrative and shift the conversation. So I think, through my journey, I hope that you guys have taken from this that I'm a regular person just like everyone else. But I made the choice to shift the narrative. I curated how I wanted that narrative to be shifted, and then I'm continuing with that commitment to continue to drive further growth and development in ways that people see Africa, people see Black women, people see what's possible. There's so many layers to this, and I'm continuing to drive change, and I hope that you guys see that I'm just a regular person and that you can do it too. Any narrative that you want shifted, whether it's in your personal life, professional life, it's possible. So I hope you're inspired to do that. Thank you.
So I want to touch on something you mentioned about your collegiate career. So you said All-American means pretty good. But as I understand it, you have the Kentucky record for triple jump, kind of the best. And you were also an academic All-American. So how do you balance being really, really competitive at 2 different things?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I have to report that my records did just get broken recently, which was very sad, but I held them for over 10 years, which is a long time. But for me, that's always been how I've been, is to balance both academics and athletics. The two have always gone hand in hand. At my house, I don't know, you have Nigerian parents? It wasn't
Two of them.
Yeah. It wasn't a choice. It wasn't an option. You couldn't do one without the other. If the grades were slipping, athletics were cut. So I always had to make sure that I balanced both. Yeah.
And was it difficult to go from track and field, where clearly you were very knowledgeable and top of your game, to something where you didn't even know where to begin? That transition from when you go to change the narrative, there's a courage for overcoming some kind of fear of being an imposter. Can you dig into that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I think, they look very foreign, track and field and skeleton, but the more I've spent time in the sport, I'm now starting to see more and more similarities. But when I was new, I didn't see a lot of similarities. It was very terrifying at first. But what I did is actually what I mentioned in my talk, which is really press into my strengths and press into myself, which sounds selfish. But one thing that I was able to pick up very quickly is the 30-meter sprint. So once I realized that I was good at that, I was like, I'm going to do this all day. So for the first 5-6 seconds of the race, I'm actually in the lead, which was really exciting. At the Olympics, at a point, I was in medal position. But there's the rest of the track. So the race is about 60 seconds, sorry. And so what I'm working on now to close that gap is to be a better driver. So I used my strength. I operated from a position of strength. What am I good at? The 30-meter sprint, and I just tried to dominate that as much as I could. I had the third best time at the Olympics, and so for somebody who had been in the sport for about 100 days, I thought that was pretty good. So I just always feel that if you can operate from a position of strength, you're never an imposter.
Yeah, and on that, in your talk, you mentioned changing the narrative and multiple levels of it, which I thought was great. When I was watching you in the Olympics, I was listening to the announcers speak about that point, about from the drive and through the first couple of time checkpoints that you were in the lead, and that people were sort of like, hey, the Nigerians are here cute. It's like, whoa, oh, wait, she's starting to win some events, and you'd won some events before that. Yeah. Have you noticed a change in how helpful some of your competitors are as people start to realize you can become a better driver, easier than you can just magically get faster? Yeah.
Skeleton is an interesting sport, and people really keep their cards close to them. And so, yes, as you're getting better and better, naturally the competition is not maybe as open. When you're finishing dead last, everybody's like, oh, yeah, maybe try this. But when you start showing some promise, people are a little bit more secretive.
You work as a product marketing manager for Nike, working on campaigns for, you mentioned like Venus and Serena, and it's interesting now that's you, right? Now people like me are inspired by you and look to you, and now Nike's they're making shoes for you. How has that transition felt, and has that been weird or?
It's definitely been strange because I was so used to being on the other side, so working on campaigns for other athletes. And so when the team actually brought that commercial and showed me for the first time, I just felt so vulnerable because, I'm used to being the one calling the shots and saying, okay, we need to touch on this insight, but now the team was asking me and trying to dig into how I feel to capture the essence of the emotion that you saw in that ad. So it just was a very different experience, but it was really cool. I mean, hey, being a Nike athlete is never a bad thing. And I actually have just recently made the transition more to focus on being a Nike athlete versus working in the corporate space because I want to spend more time doing the work that I'm doing around shifting the narrative on a deeper level as an advocate continuing my journey to 2022. So yeah, it's been an interesting kind of relationship being on the other side as a Nike athlete, but cool as well.
Yeah, and touching on advocacy, it's more than just doing two things. You do many things. So can you tell us a little bit about the work with the Malala Foundation and Obama, and what's all that?
Yes. So this whole skeleton thing was not planned, like I said. But what was cool about it was that I really realized that my story somehow inspired other people. And so I have taken it very seriously to use my platform responsibly, as I call it. So coming out of the Olympics, I looked for those opportunities where I could drive social impact. One of them being Malala Fund. Nigeria is one of Malala Fund's priority countries. There are more girls out of school in that country, in Nigeria, than anywhere else in Africa. And so it's a very serious issue. And so I thought, if there's anything that I can do to bring awareness and to, raise money, I'll do it. So I've been working closely with them as an ambassador to do that. And then I was super excited because I was selected as one of the Obama Foundation leaders. So the Obama Foundation has started a program, and I was in the inaugural class, where they selected 200 leaders from all across Africa, leaders who are creating and driving change in their communities and their countries in all kinds of different spectrums, some in government, some in sports like me, everybody doing all kinds of different things. And so the Obama Foundation is really working with us to help amplify all of the different things that we're doing and support it. So that's been cool as well. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to open it up to the room for questions, and we'll take some questions from the dory as well. Do we have a microphone to pass around? Okay.
So crazy small world. My high school big sister Sean is on the team with you, so I'll pick you up on the flyer. So that was. If you have any bad stories about her, then I can go back into it. Let me know. My first question is: you spoke a lot about the opportunity and maybe pressure of having to kind of define how the world viewed what an African woman was, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's something very similar that minorities at Google experience in a different light. It's not due to athleticism, but you consider the people that work at Google like the best of the best. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of presents this challenge or a task that is not necessarily you're not asked to do it, but it's kind of required as a part of your daily job to think about how you present yourself to coworkers and people that may not have a lot of experience in dealing with people that look like you or working with people that look like you and that genuinely want to understand more about others. But I think that can become frustrating, and especially as we look at how Black people experience our company, it's a little bit different than everyone else. So for, I guess, the Black women and the Black men in the room that have to constantly kind of feel this pressure of wanting to shift the narrative every day, what advice do you give them, or what do you tell them about the opportunity and privilege that also presents? Because it's not just work, but it's a privilege to be someone in that position to be able to have that opportunity. So how do you encourage those folks?
Yeah, I always look at it as a position of inspiration and an opportunity to inspire through what you're doing. When you're shifting the narrative, there's always going to be people who don't understand or are criticizing, a certain group or whatnot. But I like to flip it, and people say ignore the critics. I like to say inspire the critics. And so I would just say, back to what I was talking about I really had fun curating. I look at it as if I was working in a museum and I would want to curate a beautiful exhibition. What is that experience that you want people to have when they encounter you? Of course, you can only represent yourself, but knowing that as a minority group, typically, like you said, some people may only have limited experience with, just you. And so suddenly you're speaking for all Black people on earth. So as you do that, know that you can only do your best and try to inspire as you're doing that and curate it to the best that you can, working from a place of strength and just showing how you do things.
My question, I have two questions. One of them being, I have a little bit of insider knowledge. I was at my alma mater a couple weeks ago, and one of the alumni works at Nike as a category, I think she's a category sales manager, working on the women, focus on women in emerging markets. And I found it interesting that when she mentioned which markets Nike considers emerging for women, Africa wasn't in there at all. Yeah. And I just was like, and we both looked in, she was like, yeah, no, it doesn't make sense. And I was like, no, it doesn't make sense. And so that's one question as to when you talk about shifting the narrative, obviously your track is, for lack of a better term, is doing that from a Nike athlete perspective versus maybe corporate. What might that look like in a corporation? And my second question really feeds into that is, how did you sell that shifting of narrative and that story and that brand opportunity to Nike? Because, yeah, they sponsored you. Yes, you're a Nike athlete, but that wasn't a, hey, I want to try out for this team and, this will be cool. And you don't, this is a cool thing. It was, I'm sure, much more well thought out. And how did you present that opportunity?
Yeah. So the first question about kind of the lack of, I guess, recognition that Africa is on the map is something that I've personally found challenging working on the continent. And so it's not only Nike, but there's a lot of companies who are just not there yet. They are not seeing the potential and the opportunities that exist in Africa. I'm really excited because I just came from NBA All-Star Weekend, where the NBA made this huge announcement that they're starting a pro league in Africa starting next year with 12 pro teams. And I thought that that was a huge statement, that they are taking that step, making an investment to expand specifically in Africa. So I'm hoping more companies follow suit. As I mentioned, some of those stats are just amazing. I mean, I think people think of the story that we typically get, and they don't know the opportunities that exist there. So I'm just hoping that global companies more and more start seeing the opportunities within Africa. And the companies that are already there, I think you really, from having the experience of working on the continent, we had to do a lot of internal kind of advocating to make sure Africa has a seat at the table. It's 2019. It's sad that that's still the case, but it is kind of what we have to do for now. And I think if we just keep pushing, people are going to eventually open their eyes to the opportunities. So the second question is, how did I approach Nike? The funny thing is, I was minding my business, and everything happened so fast, honestly. So from the time when I tried out, like I said, in August of 2017, I wasn't really sure at that point what it would lead to. So I just snuck away to Houston for the weekend. I literally didn't tell anyone. I think we had like an offsite that Friday that I was supposed to be there, and I took the day off and went to Houston. And because I just wasn't sure, and I was like, I don't want to tell anybody, and then it turns out to be nothing. But by the time I got invited back to the team camp, I was like, okay, this could be something. So I told my boss, and one thing that I appreciate about Nike was that I had their support. I had my boss's support from day one. Even though we didn't know where it was going, she said, wow, this is amazing. If you do end up having a real shot, this is great, and I support you 100%. And so the closer and closer it got, and the more realistic that, wow, by now, like by October, it was starting to look like, okay, this is actually happening. And they were in full support. Now, I never came with like an agenda or a proposal to say, hey, can you do a commercial? At that time as an employee, I was just more worried about would I have the flexibility to pursue this opportunity. And thankfully I did. I was able to work remotely for the first few months. And then as it got closer to the games, I had to take time off, and Nike was supportive of that. It was actually the marketing team, independent of me. I didn't ask anything. They thought that my story was interesting and a story that needed to be told. So big kudos to Nike. I think that was a bold step. Skeleton is not a sport that Nike really, is in the business of. Nike doesn't really do a lot with winter sports in general. But I think they just were inspired by the essence of the story and felt that it needed to be told, and that happened completely independently of me.
It would have been awkward if you signed with Adidas, too.
Yeah.
How's it going? My name's Jonathan. So I'm originally from Texas, and one of the reasons I moved out to California was because it was easier for me to be in tech here than it was in Texas, especially being African American. And I noticed you said you lived many places in the U.S. and also lived many places in Africa. And I'm wondering, just from your personal experience, did you find a place or location where maybe it was easier for Black people to thrive or become more successful in like careers like tech, like high value careers like tech, or is it pretty much different problems, different places?
Yeah, I would say the latter. But I actually think Johannesburg has been a place where I really feel like has a lot of great things about it. You have a lot of affluent Black people doing a lot of different things in different industries. South Africa now has a little bit of a trickier background because they're just 20 plus years from apartheid, post-apartheid, so that adds some complexities. But just in terms of opportunities and everything like that, it's very diverse there, and I've enjoyed living there. I would say it's probably, the most diverse place that I've lived. I mean, Portland, Oregon wasn't really diverse, but I also grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. I lived in Canada. So I think Johannesburg has that perfect blend of diversity and opportunities for everyone, really. Yeah.
And your baby brother is changing some narratives as well, right?
Yeah, a little bit.
A little bit. For those Googlers who are members of Dev Color, is founded by Makinde, who's Simi's younger brother. So, yeah. I'm going to go to the Dory and see if we can take one Dory question. The question is, your story is pretty interesting. Have you considered selling it to Hollywood? Making a movie?
Well,
I could play assistant coach. Just give me one line.
No, I do think there are opportunities to tell the story, and I've considered kind of what the best platforms to do that would be, whether it's through books or movies, etc. So my agent is waiting. If they know somebody, tell them to call my people.
Yes, where's the next question? Right here.
So growing up, I'm from Cameroon, we're neighbors, and I learned figure skating when I grew up here. And I was wondering, you talked about the talent that's in Africa, both on the continent, but also people whose families have immigrated here. How do we connect people with those interests or passions with that opportunity, both on the continent and also here?
Yeah, I think that's a huge thing because the diaspora is so big. Are you asking specifically about in winter sports or just in general connecting them?
In general.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, the best answer to that, but I definitely see that it needs to happen. A couple years ago, I went to the Harvard Business School Africa Business Conference, and they had a ton of people, mostly from the diaspora, talking about kind of some of these topics of what's happening on the continent, how we can shift the narrative. And I thought it was a lot of good dialogue, but I thought what was missing was connecting it back to those that are actually in Africa. I happen to have traveled there from Johannesburg, but outside of me, I don't think there were many people who were coming from Africa to attend that conference. So I think there definitely needs to be those spaces, and maybe digital, we are at Google, is the space to find those connections, because obviously physical is not always feasible for different reasons. But I think the more and more we can have those opportunities to connect, the better that we can lift and elevate Africa as a whole, whether you're in the diaspora or actually living on the continent. So.
Thank you.
And so, for those of us that want to continue following your story, like what's the website, social media, like what's the best way?
Thank you, because I did forget to put it on here. So, all my handles are Simi Slays, Simi, and then I spell Slays SLEIGHS. That's the way you do sleighs.
Like
in the
Santa.
sport. Yes, like Santa. So, so simisleighs.com, and then all Instagram, Twitter, Facebook is at simisleighs.
Awesome. And a request, a slightly selfish request from me is, it's possible to buy, LeBron jerseys and such in women's sizes. It's not as easy to buy, like, say, Rapinoe jerseys or Simi jerseys in men's sizes. So when you get back to Nike, if you could put that little request in,
We'll put the word in.
Yeah, I'm a 2XL.
We got to get you on a sled though first.
Ooh, it might break. How thick is the ice? How thick is the ice? Well, thank you so much. This has been fascinating, and we've really enjoyed watching your story and hearing about how we can kind of think about changing the narrative in our own lives. And you've done it in several different contexts, and I think it's something that all of us are trying to do here as well. So, yeah, this has really been great.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Round of
Thank you for
applause.
having me.